Now we have the last talk of the session, and is Shalom Henderson from the MRC Cognition and Brain Science Unit and Department of Clinical Neurosciences. And she will give a talk on language, brain, and disorder, a search for simplicity.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Shads Henderson, and it's a great honor to be invited to speak at the CNS. I like to start out by stating the obvious that dementia is not just about memory. Language is affected in many dementias as a dominant or adjunctive symptom. In the case of primary progressive aphasia, which belongs to the frontotemporal lobar degeneration family, speech and or language deficits are in fact the primary symptom. There are three internationally recognized subtypes, namely the semantic variant, and I'll be using the term semantic dementia synonymously throughout this talk, the non-fluent variant, and the logopenic variant. Language deficits are also common in Alzheimer's disease as an adjunctive, so in other words, concomitant with memory or other deficits, but it can also be dominant because most LVPPAs actually have Alzheimer's disease pathology. Language problems can also occur in Lewy body dementia, which we just learned about in more detail, Parkinson's disease, as well as Parkinson plus disorders, including corticobasal syndrome and progressive supranuclear palsy, where motor speech and or language changes may present alongside or actually precede motor symptoms. So I think what is really evident is that progressive language deterioration negatively impacts individuals' quality of life, care burden, and outcome. On a more positive note, over the years, we have seen advances in the cognitive neuroscience of language, extending beyond the classical Broca's and Wernicke's model to early speech-language processing models. Recently, we have seen more computational and theoretical models of language, including the hub and spoke framework represented here and developed by Professor Matt Lambenrouth and colleagues, where the general idea is that the anterior temporal lobes serve as a semantic hub that interacts with modality-specific spokes that are distributed across the brain. Empirically, this framework is actually motivated a lot by what we know of semantic dementia. For those of you who work with semantic dementia, you might agree that they have quite a stereotype pattern of atrophy in the anterior temporal lobes, often starting in the left before spreading bilaterally. And they also present with semantic impairments across all types of modalities and types of concepts, suggesting that the ATLs might actually be an amodal semantic or conceptual hub. This is just one example of how our understanding about language is coupled with our insights about diseases and may inform approaches about diagnosis, management, and treatment. Today, I'm going to talk about three exemplars of our work in Cambridge, where we first investigated the barriers to the traditional assessments of progressive aphasias. And I'll talk a little bit about our ways we can improve clinical characterizations of language-led dementias. Starting with assessments, of course, there are validated test batteries. Some of you might know of the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Exam or the Western Aphasia Battery. But you might agree that these take a very long time to administer and score and interpret. In addition, it also requires a little bit of expertise knowledge that's not widely accessible. So some of you who work in dementia clinics, you might not have the luxury of 30 minutes to an hour to administer a comprehensive assessment and may resort to an ASAR or maybe just a verbal fluency, because it takes a minute to assess someone's letter or phonemic fluency and another minute for a category of semantic fluency. And owing greatly to prior early work by Professors Carolyn Patterson, John Hodges, Matt Lambenrouth, and others, we have a pretty good understanding about the word usage of semantic dementia. As shown in this example of an individual with SVPPA, they said paper, pen, past, prints, pig, and place. And all of these words are pretty high frequency. And the general idea is that frequently encountered items form stronger representations that are more robust in the face of semantic degradation. To unpack that a little bit, in simple terms, semantic dementia individuals have a selected deficit for low frequency words or concepts. So they often say words that are a bit higher frequency, earlier acquired, less imageable, and more semantically diverse. But what do we know about the two other subtypes of PPA, let alone CBS and PSP? I think Professor Rowe can confirm that there are some odd patients with a clinical diagnosis of PSP who come to clinic, and their only two words that begin with the letter P are ptarmigan and pterodactyl. Very strange and low frequency irregular words. So in this study, we asked whether we can differentiate groups by the total number of words produced, as well as some of these lexicosemantic features of words that they generate. Our sample consisted of 33 healthy controls, as well as 139 patients who were all matched in age and education. We obtained fluency data from their baseline clinical data, and we analyzed the total words as well as some of these word features. And unsurprisingly, controls performed better than all of the patients, and we did not see differences in the patients. And controls also produced more words for category relative to letter frequency. In the paper, we go into a little bit more detail about the multivariate investigation of the lexicosemantic features of words. But for the sake of this paper, I'm just highlighting the raw curves here, showing that when comparing controls and patients, the total words is actually excellent at differentiating them. But when we look at each of the patient groups against one another, we see very weak differentiation. So I'll leave the takeaways here, but one line summary would be that verbal fluency is actually excellent and an efficient tool to identify individuals with a neurodegenerative condition, but has limited use when it comes to diagnostication between specific patient groups. Now, something that most clinicians do routinely is simply to have conversations with patients. And listening to speech is actually very useful clinically, and many speech-language pathologists use structured as well as unstructured narratives to detect communication difficulties. Speech elicited by a picture, so this is the infamous cookie theft picture. There are updated ones, but I figured I'd show the original picture. It's easy, quick, and simple to elicit. And prior research has shown that it's really sensitive to the aphasia subtypes, not only in stroke, but as well as PPA. To give you an example of what this is like, I'm going to play two very brief audio files.
Looks like she was washing, but now it's flowing over. And, he's falling off, but holding on to something.
And the next one, please.
In the kitchen, the boy he's taking the cookie.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think all of us can agree that the first gentleman was fluent, at least, but it was devoid of important content words. So if you look at the picture, you might want to say the sink is overflowing. The boy, instead of he, is falling off. You might say the boy is falling off the stool, for instance. So there's a lot of lack of content words that are replaced by pronouns and high-frequency words like something, for instance. The second chap's speech was non-fluent, so there was a detectable motor speech impairment that was characterized by apraxia of speech. You might have also noticed reduced syntactic complexity, so all of the phrases were mostly single words. There were a longer pause duration as well, and attempts at self-correction when he goes cooker, oh no, actually cookie. So these are all features that are quite characteristic of the non-fluent variant of PPA. There are some caveats to using the cookie theft or picture description test in general, and that it's time consuming to transcribe. And I'll show you an example of what a transcript looks like. But more importantly, analyses are inconsistently carried out by clinicians, SLPs, or just regular clinicians, as well as between centers. So there is no single method of interpreting this in a validated way. So to this end, we conducted a formal qualitative and quantitative analysis of connected speech using the data from the MLSE, and I'll explain in a few minutes what that is, from the site in Cambridge, which included patients with PPA, PSP, and CDS. And the two picture prompts were the cookie theft as well as the MLSE beach scene. And I transcribe all of the speech samples either by listening or watching the videos using a software called F4 Transcript. And I'll briefly play a video just to see what she says and how I transcribe them.
Well, I assume they've gone on a holiday onto the lovely water And it must be warm because they've taken their clothes off. They've got the clothes on that is perfect in a hot place. And there's a
Perfect. I like using this video because it illustrates that many individuals with SV and LVPPA are actually able to circumlocute beautifully like this individual. Even though she was not able to come up with the word swimsuit or bikini, she said they've taken their clothes off and they put on clothes that's perfect for a hot day. So you get what they're trying to say, even though you detect that significant word retrieval difficulty. So our aim for this study was very simple, and we had psychologists who are barefoot, or clinicians who are doing home visits, or people in clinic who only have 5 minutes to assess someone quickly. So how can we develop a simple and practical word checklist that we can use with these pictures? And clinically, you might observe that many individuals with semantic dementia will omit words like overflow, sink, and stool, but how can we show this in a data-driven way? And we're able to do this with a regression called least absolute shrinkage and selection operation. I'm going to be very simple here and say that all of the unique words produced by patients and controls were all included as predictors in the model. And we asked, what are the least amount of words that could best differentiate between two groups? So ideally, if we're thinking about SVPPAs, you would want words like stool and overflow to be included. So when we do this in controls versus SD, this is in fact what we find. We have words like overflow, stool, open, and coming. The latter two, because these are words that are more used by semantic dementia. Instead of saying sink is overflowing, they tend to say the water is coming down, for instance. We also calculated the within sample K-fold classification, which was 100%. And we did this for each of the patient group comparisons as well. Compiled all of these words and rank ordered them in the number of times they appear, as well as the magnitude of the difference, leaving us with top 15 words. So using this top 15 words, we tested using our lasso model again, here showing the within sample K-fold validation between patients, motor versus temporal groups, and at the individual level. Of note, there were no words that could differentiate between SV and LVPPA because their word usage were quite similar. Now we wanted to test for the generalizability of our model and our checklist, so we actually conducted out-of-sample predictive validity testing with unseen data from St. George's Hospital. And we found at the top level outstanding or moderately good accuracies, and but not so much for non-fluent variant and CBS. When supplementing the model with measures of cognition, so 15 words plus ACR and MLSE scores, we found that it didn't really improve that much for at the top level. But for SVs and LVPPAs where no words survived, actually including the subdomain scores of a test, a validated test, improved their diagnostic accuracy. To summarize rather quickly, what we did was we created a 15-word checklist which had outstanding within group K-fold validation, and we found this to be generalizable to out-of-sample data. And we proposed that this might be a good screening test to identify someone with a progressive aphasia quickly, even though further testing is warranted, particularly for groups such as SV and LVPPA. So what is the MLSE? I've been alluding to this a few times. The Mini Linguistic State Examination Study is a massive multi-center effort between St. George's Hospital, led by Professor Peter Gerard, Dr. Nikhil Patel, Cambridge, largely spearheaded by Dr. Katie Peterson, as well as Professor Rowe and many others, and a site in Manchester. It's a very brief test that's only about 10 to 20 minutes. It's practical because it's really easy to administer, score, and interpret. And more importantly, it's thought to be really sensitive in the PPA, the 3 subtypes, as well as the language, capturing the language deficits in PSP and CBS. I've included a QR code here in case anyone is interested in finding out more. It's available in multiple languages, and we have a workshop coming up, and more languages are currently being added. Just to briefly highlight the differential diagnosis that we might have not have gotten with at the SV and LVPPA level, with the MLSE, you see clear differentiation between SV and LVPPA with phonology, working memory, and semantic. semantics, and this also extends to the tauopathies with non-fluent variant PSP and CBS patients. So in summary, I use the term ESR here, which is used in general medicine to notice if you have a systemic disorder. We might propose that verbal fluency is like a cognitive ESR. It's excellent at actually telling you whether you have a cognitive problem, even though further testing is warranted afterwards. We propose that the word checklist is a suitable screening test to identify someone quickly with a progressive aphasia. 15 words you can check or X out whatever words that they don't produce. And I was the first sample to actually test it out, and it was very easy to do while listening to someone describing the picture. And for sensitive differentiation between certain groups, tests like MLSE, if you have the time, is excellent. Before moving on to the next part of my talk, I wanted to briefly pause and share that in our lab, we like to think about and achieve better diagnosis, better treatment, and better prevention. Sorry for stealing your words, James. But to achieve better diagnosis, one way might be to think about assessment. How can we make this more accessible, simple, and scalable and sensitive? Another way is to think about improving clinical characterization. Where are our gaps in our knowledge when it comes to the clinical features related to certain phenotypes related to FTLD? So for the next 5 minutes, I'll be talking about genetic semantic dementia and how they compare to what we know in sporadic semantic dementia, and also give a very brief overview of the cognitive profiles of LVPPA. So according to a study by Jonathan Rohr and Jason Warren, about a third to a half of individuals with FTD are thought to have a familiar disorder with mutation either in granulin, MAPT, and CNS2023. We've learned a great deal about this already, so I won't go into detail. But SD is thought to be the least hereditary, with only about 2 to 7% of patients, according to one study, with a suggested family history. To cut to the chase, we don't know much about the prevalence of genetic SD and how they compare. Are they similar or dissimilar to what we already know about the sporadic semantic dementia? So to this end, we completed a systematic review, initially starting with about 2,684 papers, but we only actually ended up with 20. These 20 papers included genetic cases of semantic dementia and had sufficient clinical and language details available. We also obtained five genetic SD cases from GenFi, and this is an active ongoing study with the mentorship of the brilliant Professor Carolyn Patterson. Just to briefly highlight some of the findings, we found a predominance of men in the MAPT group and of women in the granulin. Mean age was youngest in the MAPT and oldest in the granulin. First symptom was reported to be in 100% of the cases in the MAPT, but about 67% in the two other groups. Isolated language. So SVPPA is supposed to be isolated language, but in the genetic cases, 79% was the highest in the MAPT group. Behavioral deficits occurred in all of the genetic groups, initially emerging in the granulin, later emerging in the MAPT, and even split in the C9 cases. And for cases that, for imaging that was available, ATL atrophy was reported or shown in all of the cases. We received 5 cases from GenFi, a single case with a MAPT mutation, and she presented with language, memory, and behavioral, all initial presentation, and had ATL atrophy on inspection. Our single granulin case did not tolerate the scan, and there was no testing available. It's unclear if she was not able to do the testing. But what was really unusual about this case was that according to the clinical exam, she had severe multi-domain language impairment, areas where you would not expect in SD, including articulation, grammar and syntax, as well as comprehension, language comprehension, including motor speech, dysarthria, and with some Parkinsonism. The 3 C9 cases all had initial significant behavior and language deficits. Some of you might be looking at this table. For those of you who work in SD might say, that looks unusual, there might be a typo, because the BNT and semantic tests like the camel and cactus semantic dementia patients are at floor. So you might see scores like 6 out of 30 or maybe 5 out of 30. So these are unusually high. So when we do a Bayesian analysis comparing these scores to a normative sample of sporadic SDs from Samara et al., we find that these scores are significantly higher than what you would typically find in sporadic semantic dementia. So I would cautiously just conclude that what we find so far in the 5 genetic cases from GEMFI and the majority of the cases from the systematic review, they don't quite fit into the classical clinical presentation of what we would expect in semantic dementia. I'd like to end with giving a quick overview of cognitive profiles in LVPPA compared to typical AD. And note that the classical nosology of syndromes such as LVPPA is very inspirational, but I think there are limitations. One ongoing debate is whether LVPPA remains a language-predominant symptom with disease duration or if they develop other cognitive deficits. So this is one area of my PhD that I am exploring, and I'll be showing very preliminary data today, including 13 LVPPA, 7 typical AD, so these are individuals who have an amnestic presentation. So when we look at their language, starting with the LVPPA, we see deficits and the domains that you would expect: the lexical retrieval, phonology, working memory, and comprehension. And unsurprisingly, AD patients are preserved in language. When we look at executive functioning, we see a deficit, overall deficit in LVPPA group, and quite similar in the typical AD group. And finally, when we look at memory, and I'm presenting the AD group first because in typical AD, their core deficit is memory. So if language is just, if LVPPA is just predominantly language, we would see an overall preservation. This might not be a surprise to some of you in the room, but this is the pattern that we found. They were quite similar to the typical AD. So to wrap this this portion of my talk, I'd say that LVPPAs and typical ADs seem to share many overlapping clinical features, including deficits in verbal as well as nonverbal memory. And this has already been shown and published by Dr. Sid Ramanan, who is a postdoc researcher in our lab. And as in my final year of PhD, I am investigating this longitudinally. So I'm tracking patients with LVPPA to better understand the progression and severity of cognitive deficits and how they relate to the spread of atrophy over time. I think that I made this point already. We need early and accurate diagnosis to get these individuals included in clinical trials and interventions. I have many people to thank, so I'll leave my acknowledgments here, but I wanted to personally express my gratitude to the organizers of the CNS for including an ECR like myself. This has been an incredible opportunity, and thank you all for your attention.